Victorian Sunday is going to produce. And I think it's very interesting that also she is one of the youngest students presenting her talk, and that's very encouraging for a lot of the entire student community as well. So, yeah, we are very hopeful and very excited to welcome you, Caitlin. So, Caitlin will be speaking on the topic Friends and Lovers, the Dichotomy of Intersex Relationship in Bram Stoker's Dracula. So, yeah, now the stage is over to you, Caitlin. You can start your presentation.
Okay, I am going to share my screen. Okay, can you see it? Can you see it?
Yes. It's visible.
Okay. Awesome. And my notes are right here, so I might be looking back and forth. So to start off with my topic, I'm doing Friends and Lovers, the Dichotomy of Intersex Relationships in Bram Stoker's Dracula. My name is Caitlin Tiarina. To talk a little bit about me, I am pursuing my bachelor's in English with a concentration in literature. And then this fall, I'm starting my master's in teaching literature and writing composition. I have one other academic publication right now, Women Poets of the Irish Troubles, Defining Themes. So talking about my paper. So some people in modern day society don't think that men and women should be friends, but this was ever so the case in Victorian England, as men and women's social lives were kept separate. Bram Stoker portrays men and women as both friends and partners. However, the same relationships he labels as platonic often overstep their boundaries. So to go into the background, our first example of vampires in literature was Carmilla by Joseph Le Fanu, published in 1872. This was notable because it was actually a sapphic piece. Additionally, the way that vampires prey on their people is through sucking their blood through their neck, which is an erogenous zone. So vampires have always been circulated around sex and sexuality. Bram Stoker was born in 1847 in Dublin, Ireland. He moved to England in 1878 and published Dracula in 1897. This was just around the turn of the century. This was the same time that Oscar Wilde and Arthur Conan Doyle were writing. It's important to note that some people theorize that Bram Stoker was homosexual because his wife was a previous suitor of Oscar Wilde. So some people think that might be a lavender marriage. Additionally, Dracula, the story is riddled with sexual undertones between many of the characters, not only the men and the women. And some people argue that the sexism that is in Dracula is a representation of Stoker's underlying resentment of women because of the strict gender boundaries that he was put into, especially because homosexuality was illegal. So the gender roles in Victorian England were very strict. Men and women were kept pretty much separate. They had interactions, but they didn't have these deep, intimate relationships that we see now in this 21st century. Men's role in Victorian society was to get married, have children, and then work to support the children and then their family, especially any other women in their family. And then women's role was to get married, bear the children, and then take care of the children and to have as many children as possible. Additionally, homosexual relationships were more easy to come by just because people had these intimate relationships with men had intimate relationships with other men because they saw them as equals, and women had relationships with other women because those were who they mainly interacted with. In relationships between men and women, chaperones were needed. I have this quote from an encyclopedia of good manners and social standing. This was published in the 1920s. This goes to show just how strict it was between men and women's relationships, that you needed chaperones to interact. Even married women could interact outside of chaperones, but it was still seen as inappropriate to be around men and for men and women to be around each other too much at all in any context. So I looked at 3 different papers in my literature review, which is the first half of my paper. The first paper I looked at is Feminism, Sex Role Exchanges, and Other Subliminal Fantasies in Bram Stoker's Dracula by Stephanie Dimitrakopoulos. So she goes into several different points of sex and sexuality, which was the main theme I was looking at. Uh, First is the rejection of female roles. In Bram Stoker's Dracula, we have vampiric women. We see 3 vampiric women who are already turned at the very beginning in a scene where Harker is in a chair and he was exploring Transylvania, and the women come in and start to um, they're preparing to attack him, and he is just sitting there waiting. And we see those women, and then later we see how Lucy and Mina react to being turned into vampires. We have the original rejection of motherhood. So these vampiric women later go to attack a small child, and then Lucy later also attacks a child. This could be seen as something that was kind of freeing from the roles that women were placed into as Victorian women were reading this story. We have these vampiric women who were so opposite to what these strict roles were. Additionally, we have the initiation of sexuality. These women are pursuing Harker, whether he wants it or not. And later we have Lucy attacking the men. So, because this vampiric state was seen as a almost like a euphemism for sexuality, these women step outside of these Victorian um, standards. Next is the male desire of passivity, which also goes into this scene where Harker is almost waiting with like closed eyes and a bated breath for these women to attack him before Dracula enters. But this goes into almost a subliminal fantasy of male's passivity because, again, these roles were strict, so men didn't really feel like they had the ability to be passive. Next is the violation of good women. This is a theme that we've seen throughout time about the corruption of innocent women. We start off this story with Mina and Lucy, who are these almost idealistic versions of women in Victorian society, even more so Lucy, who is seen as innocent and submissive. And then we have Mina, who is a little bit outside of it. She's described as having a male mind, yet they're both violated in one way. And I will go into that a little bit more later. Next is the narrative method of Dracula by David Seed. So, with Lucy at the beginning of the story, she is proposed to by 3 men. This is a rhetorical parallelism to Harker being preyed upon by 3 women. Additionally, Lucy, at one point, she is being turned into a vampire. She's in the process and she's in bed with her mother. A wolf jumps through the window and her mom dies of fright. Now, this symbolizes the death of the maternal and Lucy and is the last thing that happened before she is turned into a vampire, just representing how vampires are so far away from that traditional maternal state. Next is Out of Time, Queer Monstrosity, and Eugenic Monstrosity by Thomas Stewart. So he talks about Harker's homosexuality. So when we have this scene with the 3 women, Harker is waiting for them to attack him. Dracula stops them, claims Harker as his own. Harker passes out and then wakes up in different clothing. And he mentions that Dracula must have had to change him. So this talks about the how Harker is, sorry, I lost my thought. How Harker is outside of this traditional gender role also, about how not only is he passive, but there is this mention of potentially Dracula and Harker's relationship. Dracula himself stands outside of the gender bounds. He's described as having hard phallic teeth, but also soft, shivering lips. Additionally, Stewart argues that the process of sucking the blood borders on phallic. Lastly is eugenics. Eugenics was a very important part of Victorian times. They really wanted to create more Victorian white individuals in the upper class. So by propelling eugenics, that helped that goal. But Dracula and the other vampires stand starkly outside of this because they don't create more people. Rather, they turn people from these upstanding Victorian citizens to vampires. So my thesis focuses around the inappropriate relationship that Lucy and Mina have with the men in the story, and these are indicative of subtextual polyandrous relationships. Polyandry is a form of polygamy where a woman has multiple husbands simultaneously. So looking at the main characters in the story, I have 3 different sections. So first we have the main women, Lucy and Mina, and then the men, so Jonathan Harker, who is Mina's husband and the first victim of Dracula, Arthur Homewood, who is Lucy's fiance and English aristocrat, Dr. Van Helsing, who is a doctor of Western medicine, Dr. John Seward, who is a doctor and caretaker of an asylum patient, and Quincy Morris, an outspoken American. So Arthur, Seward, and Quincy all propose to Lucy at the very beginning of the story, and she is engaged to Arthur afterwards. And then Lucy and Mina start the story. Jonathan and Mina start the story engaged and then get married. So the 3 points that I have to argue for this inappropriate relationship is the intimacy between the characters, the boundaries that are crossed, and then the implicative language. So to start off with, we have Seward's vigil. At the very beginning, Lucy is slowly being turned in. She is being preyed upon by Dracula. He is coming in the night, draining her of blood, and she is getting continuously sicker, and she doesn't want to sleep. She's more tired. So Seward watches her sleep for a night. This is already crossing all sorts of etiquette boundaries. You have a woman who is engaged in a room with a man who with a bachelor man, and the door is closed. You don't have any chaperones or servants. So already this steps outside of what would be deemed appropriate. Additionally, he narrates her lips were slightly parted and her breast rose and fell with the regularity of a pendulum. His attention to her lips and breasts also indicate a deeper sexual attraction on his point, and she has to trust him enough to let him sleep in the room with her. Next is Quincy's death. So at this point in the story, Mina is almost fully transformed into a vampire. Dracula dies, and then she becomes purified again. And Quincy, as he is dying, he says it was worth for this to die, which just represents how much he cared about Mina. Next is the boundaries that are crossed. So Arthur has just lost Arthur has just lost Lucy and is now sobbing. Mina sits down next to him. She writes, I sat down beside him and took his hand. I hope he didn't think it forward of me. This little narration at the very back is what is so important because she understands that she is crossing these boundaries because she says, I hope he didn't think it forward of me. So that is an example of that being crossed where she is holding this hand of another man. He is crying on her, which is inappropriate for a masculine man at the time. Next is Lucy's proposals. So she is proposed to by 3 times. She is writing to Mina about this experience. And she writes, why can't they let why can't they let a girl marry 3 men or as many as want her and save all this trouble? But this is hearsay and I must not say it. Again, you have her being cognizant of this inappropriateness of how she, as a Victorian woman, should not be interested in 3 men. She should not be lusting after these 3 men. And she even says that it is hearsay. Additionally, for Quincy's proposal, after she rejects him, she still kisses him, which is against etiquette. Next is her transfusions. In many cultures, blood transfusions are seen as impure within themselves, but also she gets 4 transfusions from the men. Only Arthur, though she is in a relationship with, she's engaged. And Seward, this is right after she dies and Arthur is in mourning. Seward recounts that Arthur was speaking of his part in the operation where his blood had been transfused into Lucy's veins. This was to keep her from dying from blood loss. Arthur was saying that he felt since then as if the 2 of them had really been married and that she was his wife in the sight of God. None of us said a word of the other operations, and none of us ever shall. So he's acknowledging that there was almost this boundary crossed, that Arthur doesn't know that Lucy has the blood of the other men. And because Arthur mentions that that they are actually married because of the transfusion, that suggests that she is also married to the other men, which is Quincy, Seward, and Van Helsing. Additionally, Seward acknowledges this because he says that he will not tell Arthur. Then Mina's housing. So Mina actually lives with all of the men at one point in the story. That they are living above the insane asylum that Dr. Seward takes care of Renfield in. And while this would not have happened because it was inappropriate for a bachelor, especially a bachelor that was not related to the man or the woman, to live with them. And then apart from that, we have scenes that we see in the story with both Mina and someone who is not Jonathan in a room alone. And because they live together, it's probably even more common. Next is the implicative language. We have Dr. Seward and Mina, specifically their relationship. So Lucy and Mina are writing back and forth to each other throughout the beginning of the novel. And after Lucy's proposal, she is writing towards Mina, who is engaged to Jonathan at the time. And Lucy writes that Seward would just do for you. So even though Mina is engaged, Lucy is saying, you would be interested in this man. And Mina remembers this, but not only that, Seward, who has gone through a lot of their writings because they are trying to recount what is happening with Dracula, when they meet each other in person for the first time, they both blush and look away. Then lastly, Mina is slowly turning more vampiric as the story continues. And vampires are defined and characterized by their interest in sex and sexuality. She is eating less and less, and she is sleeping during the day and not during the night. So we can see this transformation slowly. But Seward wakes up to her watching him sleep. He writes, but presently I forget all of the watching, and when I suddenly remember that I watch, I find her lying quiet but awake and looking at me with so bright eyes. So this is almost a double entendre, as she is looking at him maybe to feed on him because she is hungry and not eating, but also in the euphemism for sexuality. So next is how they are punished. Women are often punished for the same things that they are sexualized for. Lucy specifically has a very violent um, arc. So she starts by suffering through Dracula, where he is draining her of her blood. She's getting sicker. She can't sleep. She's growing weaker. Additionally, it's important to note that she gets her blood transfusions without her consent or her knowledge. The men keep her outside of this knowledge of what is happening to her and her body and give her blood transfusions without her knowledge or consent. Additionally, she is presented as more innocent than Mina, more innocent, that she's dumber, submissive. Mina even almost takes on the role of a man at one point and is taking care of her consistently, while Mina is a little bit more masculine, as she is said to have a man's mind. Not only is Lucy getting slowly sicker, but she dies, turns into a vampire, and then the men go out to set to kill her. Arthur, her fiance, is the one who eventually does kill her, and it is very graphic. Seward narrates, Arthur took the stake and the hammer. Then he struck with all his might. The thing in the coffin writhed, and a hideous, blood-curdling screech came from the opened red lips. The body shook and quivered and twisted in wild contortions. The sharp white teeth champed together till the lips were cut and the mouth was smeared with crimson foam. So we have Lucy, who starts out the story as a traditional, upstanding Victorian woman. And then throughout this time of becoming a vampire, she suffers and then eventually is murdered by Arthur, her fiance. Next is Mina. So Mina is a big part of the story. She is the one who reads Jonathan's diary and begins to connect the dots with what happened to Lucy with the help of Seward. She transcribes his shorthand and she works with Jonathan to organize all of the papers to figure out what is happening with Dracula. Even though she has done all of this work and all of this help to figure out what is happening with Dracula, as soon as the men have all of the information, they immediately exclude her from the conversation. They decide that she is too feminine and too weak to handle the information and that she should be left out of decisions and of actions, which in turn makes her sicker. She is, at this point, she is starting to be preyed upon by Dracula. And with the combination of the men excluding her, she becomes more worried and therefore sicker. So you have this interesting juxtaposition with the men in the story, specifically with like Harker, we have this passivity at the beginning of the story, and then you have um, Arthur killing Lucy, and then later you have Jonathan attacking Dracula. This it was Dramatopoulos said that the male as a passive rape victim and also as victor, violator, brutalizer reflect the polarized sex roles and the excessive needs this polarizing engendered in Victorian culture. So again, we have these men in like two separate places, one as passive, where Arthur is crying, the other men are crying, Harker is waiting to be preyed upon, and then you also have them as brutalizers, where Arthur is killing Lucy and Jonathan is fighting and the other men are fighting. Additionally, for Mina, Van Helsing actually physically burns her as she is being turned into a vampire. He puts a cross on her head and this burns her. This parallels Dracula's injury that he gets from Jonathan in an altercation. Both women additionally struggle with ideas and thoughts of impurity. So, because Lucy has these transfusions, she is seen as impure, and Mina also feels impure in the sight of God. She writes, As for me, I am not worthy in his sight, alas, I am unclean to his eyes, and shall be until he may deign to let me stand forth in his sight, as one of those who have not incurred his wrath. So even though these women are basically at the mercy of all of the men in the story, including Dracula, they are still punished for it. So the conclusions that I came to are one, that these friendships would not have existed in real life as they did in the novel. These relationships that the men have with the women would be seen positively as inappropriate. They would not have been in rooms together. They would not have showed that emotional intimacy between each other. And then women are continuously punished for existing in our literature and our society. Specifically, Lucy and Mina's intimacies fulfill a certain fantasy of polyandry, but narratively have to be punished for it so that the audience is aware of the correct morality. Dracula is a wonderful representation of both the consequences of stifling sexuality and how women are often punished for the same things that they are sexualized for. So that is my lecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a wonderful lecture, to be honest. I really enjoyed. And there are so many things that is going on my mind. I mean, I know people will going to ask a lot of questions regarding that. But again, thank you so much for this. In fact, there is this novel called Scarlet Letter, which kind of has the same sort of philosophy towards how these things are happening. Indumida, would you like to say anything?
Yes, I would like to say thank you, Kathleen, for presenting such a wonderfully like researched paper. And you have mentioned your like areas of research, and then you have mentioned your methodology, and it was like wonderful. I have a couple of questions for you, but I'll pass the privilege on to the audience first if they want to ask you questions, and then we can have the convener's questions. Will you be comfortable with that?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you, Caitlin. So I'd request the audience if they have any question to Caitlin. Caitlin is a very young student, I must say. She is not even in the PhD program. She is just joining the masters, right, Caitlin?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so just young student, very very young student presenting on Victorian Sundays today. So audience, if you have any question, kindly ask it to Caitlin. Caitlin will be very happy to answer your questions. Okay, I don't think there are any questions at this point of time, but then I will take the privilege, I will take the bet in my hand and see if I have understood your topic and your presentations correctly. So we're talking about vampires and we're talking about women, and women have always been punished. Like that was the central argument that we're trying to make. So do you think like this liminality of the vampires as well as the women in the Victorian England, they serve as spaces for expression of non-binary identity or intersex relationships? Like liminality can be itself a space of expression of non-binary identity.
So that's interesting. One of my authors actually went into it. Let me look at who it was. It
Dermatophobe
was Thomas Stewart
or thermo-
who actually mentioned that. He looked at Dracula, but also at the Beetle, and basically came to the conclusion that stepping outside of these gender bounds is what made these characters monsters. Like why Victorian society was so scared of it is because Dracula steps outside. Not only does he step outside of gender bounds, but also time boundaries and some other things like that, or sexuality boundaries with Harker. So any um anything different from the norm at the time was seen as like inherently bad or scary.
right, and also like this acts were primarily perceived as transgressions, and thereby a lot of repressions were invited to this kind of acts, right?
Can you repeat that?
yeah, like a lot of these acts were perceived as transgressions and like deviations. The deviations that you mentioned, Victorian England did perceive them as transgressions, right? And thereby they invited a kind of suppression or censorship on this kind of acts. Non-binary identity, intersex relationships.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Can you talk a little bit slower?
Okay, I am saying that like when you mention deviations, like do you mean
Mhm.
transgressions of the Victorian norms? And I'm sure that these transgressions attracted a lot of repression, suppression, and censorship, right? So even like the text goes through that. So I'm just supplementing what you said here.
Got it. Yeah.
So Rhythm, if you have any question.
Okay, it's not a question, but rather like an observation, because previously on Victorian Vanguard, we have a lecture on Oscar Wilde. And since you mentioned that there is a connection between Oscar Wilde and Dracula, so can you elaborate more on that particular point? Because it's quite interesting to find that connection here.
hmm I also thought it was super interesting because I have a specialization in Victorian literature. So I know, like, I've had a lot of research into Oscar Wilde and Arthur Conan Doyle both. So, from my understanding, Bram Stoker knew and met Oscar Wilde at least a couple of times. And then Oscar Wilde went on a couple of dates with Bram Stoker's wife. So it is possible that Bram Stoker was gay because if this woman was pursuing or like around Oscar Wilde, there's a good chance that she knew because Oscar Wilde didn't really hide his sexuality. And when he got prosecuted, it wasn't because people didn't know that he was gay, it was because of he sued someone and lost. So I also thought that that was an interesting connection between them because a lot of these authors, these Victorian authors, knew each other in some form or another.
Great. That is really interesting, to be honest. Someone has, uh, I think, asked a question in the comment box, I guess.
I have my email pinned at the top if you would like to contact me.
Okay, we will going to reshare the email in the chat box. But I have another question. It's not, again, not a question, but rather an inquiry. So
Mhm.
I have come across a discussion suggesting that Dracula's narrative might have connections to India. I mean, it sounds very odd, but I mean, in both in terms of literary inspiration and cultural parallels, if you can make, since there are a lot of things that are similar when it comes to Dracula. In fact, I don't know how relevant it is, but recently there is this movie called Dracula Sir, which was published or rather telecasted in India. So Dracula and India has a very good connection. Can you share anything? I mean, have you ever come across any sort of links that you have found in terms of Indian myths that are kind of suggesting towards Dracula or anything like that?
I haven't heard too much about Dracula's relationship with India, but he does have that Irish heritage, and Dracula really is split in between, like with Orientalism, he, you have this Transylvania area where we have these people who are really religious, and he makes a lot of like comments on the people around about how they're like um not they're not sexually attractive, but they're voluptuous. Like he makes that comment. He talks about how the trains never run right. Um, and you also have these dirt boxes that Dracula is trying to bring over from Transylvania. So it's almost like a reverse. I can't remember the word, but he's trying to bring Transylvania over here. And so that is also a part of Dracula where you have this immigrant who is coming over here and bringing his culture, and how like this is bad and we don't want this. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, and like Dracula has been kind of adapted in the Indian context. I think Rhythm wanted to like touch upon that point. It has been adapted in the Indian context, and you might look into that. It might give you another angle to your study. But we have another question in the chat box. The question is from Priyadarshini Modak. Priyadarshini says she has a question. Can you please analyze the role of patriarchy in Dracula? That's the question.
I think my whole paper actually goes into that, because I focused on the women's experiences, but the women's experiences are from how the men treat them. The biggest example I think is the men specifically keeping the women out of information, like keeping information from them. So you have Lucy, who is slowly dying from her attacks from Dracula, and Van Helsing has kind of an idea of what's happening. He keeps both the audience and the other characters in the dark about this. So not only does he kind of know what's happening, but you have Dr. Seward, who doesn't tell her that these transfusions are happening. They wait till she's asleep. They give her the transfusions while she's asleep, and she just wakes up. She's like, "Oh, I'm feeling so much better," and she doesn't know where that comes from. I think that this is an example of men not respecting a woman's right to her body or to informed consent. And then similar with Mina, where she is doing all of this hard like labor to find Dracula, where she's writing and she's doing the transcriptions and she's putting the papers together, and she has memorized all of the train schedules. Yet even though she has these contributions and has shown that she understands what she's doing, she is still kept out of the loop, and they keep trying to push her farther and farther away.
Right, that's an interesting answer. So if there's anyone else who wants to ask Kathleen a question, they're most welcome. So Priyadarshini says thank you. I think that's visible to you. So that's a well answered question. Are there any other questions to Kathleen? Okay, so I have another question. So you mentioned this like blood transfusion, and also in the case of vampire that there is like this blood transfer. So do you think this blood transfusion or blood transfer or blood exchange acts as a metaphor for sexual or gender ambiguity in the context of this text?
Of sexual ambiguity?
Yeah, or like hybridity or fluidity, like the fact that the blood is getting transferred. So is there a space for like sexual hybridity in that sense?
Of sexual hybridity?
Gender ambiguity or sexual hybridity?
I think it has less. I do think gender takes a role in Dracula, but I think the blood transfusions have more to do with like a euphemism for sex, because you have these men giving the transfusions and you're keeping the fiance out of the loop. And even at the beginning, I think it was Van Helsing who was saying to Arthur, like, this is so intimate that you're giving her your blood, and so courageous. And then you have one of the interesting scenes was Jonathan is in bed with Mina and they're sleeping, and then Dracula attacks and is having Mina like drink from him, like from a cut in his neck or his chest. And Jonathan is kind of in a like a stupor, and the other men barge in, like Quincy and Van Helsing, and Dracula basically says like, "You're mine, your women are mine, and you are mine through your women."
Right, so it's kind of like an affiliation, so to say, and like an inclusive affiliation.
I'm sorry, you cut out.
Okay, so I said like it's kind of a like an inclusive application, or like clearing a boundary, so to speak.
Hmm.
Okay, that was me. Are there any other questions?
Oh, I do know Lear Flores. Yeah.
Okay, so I so you have been asked to give some random movie recommendations. I think they are on based on Dracula. If you want to address that question, not a question per se, but yeah.
Um, I'm trying to remember. There's. Sorry, I have a dog here. Nosferatu is, I think, how you say it. Yeah, that was. Um, it's not. It was. It was way after Dracula was written, but it is a representation of
Yeah, I think it
Dracula.
was released in 1922, the first edition, of course. It was in 1922 when it was first released.
Hmm.
Okay.
And
So
as
yeah,
for books, I
yeah,
recommend reading Carmilla.
like I think there are a lot of movies which have like adapted the story of Dracula in varying forms and diversifications. There are a lot of movies, but yeah. So any other questions, guys? Any other question for Kathleen? So I think that brings us to the end. Thank you, Caitlin, for doing this. You have like presented exceptional lecture at this age, and like with your expertise, you have handled all the questions pretty gracefully. And hopefully, you'll be collaborating with us when we are going to publish the book. So sooner or later, we'll be asking for the complete paper. Ritam will be in contact with you. Ritam, if you want to deliver the concluding words.
It's okay, and thank you again for all the audience, as well as thank you so much for joining this session, Caitlin. It was a wonderful presentation. I think someone has written something on the chat box again. Indian Fakir and other superstitions. Um,
Um, I don't know if I can really speak on this.
Yeah, I think it's has to go bit on the Indian context. I think the angle of the question is like, is it superstitious to have characters like Dracula? As far as I understand the question, because somewhere down like line we mentioned Indian fakir, though I don't remember mentioning Indian fakir honestly. So I don't think Itu there has been any mention of Indian fakir. If you can rephrase your questions, or if you want to directly ask your question to Caitlin, you're most welcome to do so. Okay, it's in chapter 14 of the text, and there is a mention of Indian fakir. Right. So like, and the question is,
I'm trying to pull the chapter up.
it is like actively working on it to bring out Indian fakir in the text.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I can see that. It says, can you tell me how the Indian fakir can make himself to die and have been buried, and his grave sealed and corn sowed on it, and the corn reaped and be cut and sown and reaped and cut again, and then men come and take away the unbroken seal, and that there lie the Indian fakir, not dead, but that rise up and walk amongst them as before.
Okay, so Itu Odikari has asked the question: is it based on collaboration with various superstitions? That is her question in the context of the mention of Indian fakir. So she has asked this question: is it based on collaboration with various superstitions?
I don't really know. I didn't go into the different superstitions that came from this, but I will say that Bram Stoker, because he has that Irish heritage, there is those beliefs that he was bringing into England, and then a lot of his beliefs were very anti Eastern society.
Okay, that's great. I think that does answer Itu's question. Uh, and she says thank you to you. So yeah. So Ritam was right in the middle of delivering the concluding remarks.
So it's always a pleasure to have questions, even if I'm concluding. But thank you again for joining us. If you can also, you have that opportunity to publish through us, and that is it. I mean, thank you for joining this session. We will going to meet here again on on 8th of June, I guess. Right? No, on
And
yes,
I'm
on
going to
8th of
come
June.
here. Please share Victorian Vanguard with your friends and help your friends connect with us as well. Thank you, Katie.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Have a very good
Thank you.
morning.
Yeah, you too.